From the Gray Man Briefing, this is a summary of recent developments regarding the Second Amendment, cybersecurity, protests, supply chain disruptions, national security, law and order, free speech, censorship, government oversight, and more. Now, the latest from GraymanBriefing.com. Here's this week's Sword, read out by Super Essie.
In this week's Sword, we'll cover the Ontario Premier halting an energy surcharge after Trump threatened a tariff increase, keeping electricity costs stable. A federal court ruled suppressors are not protected under the Second Amendment, with an in-bank rehearing possible. X, formerly Twitter, experienced a major cyber attack, suspected to be linked to Ukrainian or Hamas entities. The removal of AM radio from vehicles raises concerns over censorship and emergency comms. Trump declared Biden's AUTOPEN signed pardons void, challenging their legitimacy, and a new law was introduced to decriminalize assaults on police officers. Let's begin today with government oversight. In Canada, the Premier of Ontario suspended an energy surcharge on exports to Minnesota, Michigan, and New York after Trump threatened a 25% tariff increase on steel and aluminum imports from Canada. The surcharge was revoked and the U.S. administration canceled that additional tariff, although the initial 25% tariff did take effect on March 12. This move highlights the power of trade policy and diplomatic negotiations. While Canada backed down, the initial tariffs remain in place, affecting industries reliant on steel and aluminum. Further economic tensions between the U.S. and Canada may arise depending on the future trade policy decisions. Reliance on critical infrastructure provided from sources outside the U.S. remains a top vulnerability. Trump has declared Biden's AUTOPEN signed pardons void, arguing Biden was unaware of their issuances. These included preemptive pardons for figures such as Dr. Anthony Fauci and members of the House Select Committee on January 6. Mainstream legal experts assert that AUTOPEN's use is valid, but some argue it raises constitutional concerns. Trump's claim challenges presidential authority over automated signatures. The primary argument is that Biden was not physically present during the use of multiple AUTOPEN signatures, including executive orders and his announcement to withdraw from the race. On some occasions, Biden was in another U.S. state when the AUTOPEN signed Biden's name to policies and actions in Washington, D.C. Now moving into the Second Amendment brief. The Fifth Circuit ruled that firearm suppressors are not arms under the Second Amendment in the United States versus Peterson case. The defendant requested an in-bank rehearing, and the DOJ was expected to respond by March 17th. The decision could impact future suppressor classifications. If upheld, this ruling could pave the way for stricter regulations of firearm accessories. If overturned, it could reinforce broader 2A protections, impacting future legislation on gun modifications. Separately, Trump ordered a review of firearm regulations, but no updates have been released. The deadline for Attorney General Bondi to review these policies was pushed from March 9th to March 16th. It's now been a few days past that new deadline, and we haven't seen any developments on that review. Now, let's look at another case. The Seventh Circuit upheld the National Firearm Act's restriction on short-barreled rifles in the case of United States versus Rush, rejecting arguments based on the Supreme Court's Bruin decision. The ruling contradicts historical precedent and may be challenged in the Supreme Court. With over 500,000 registered SBRs in circulation, the decision affects gun owners nationwide. The widespread ownership of SBRs further highlights that firearms are commonly owned and thus contradicts the Seventh Circuit's ruling. This ruling may trigger Supreme Court review, potentially setting a new precedent for firearm regulations. If overturned, it could lead to broader 2A protections. Now shifting into the cybersecurity briefing. On March 10th, X, formerly Twitter, faced a large-scale cyber attack disrupting its services. Elon Musk attributed it to a massive, this is his quote, a massive coordinated attack, possibly linked to Ukrainian cyber forces. The pro-Palestinian Dark Storm team claimed responsibility. The attack was a distributed denial of services, or DDoS, operation, overwhelming the network with traffic. U.S. officials continue to investigate. It demonstrates the vulnerability of major social media platforms and the potential for politically motivated cyber warfare. Now moving into our law and order briefing. In Illinois, House Bill 3458 was introduced to decriminalize aggravated battery against police officers. if the offender was experiencing a mental health episode. The bill states it would be a defense if the officer reasonably believed the individual was having a mental health episode and the person had a documented history of mental illness. Critics argue the legislation could encourage misuse and undermine law enforcement, potentially allowing individuals to evade accountability. The bill is currently under review in the Illinois General Assembly's Rules Committee. Nationally, reports indicate that 79,000 officers were assaulted in 2023, the highest rate in the past decade. If passed, this bill could reshape how law enforcement handles violent encounters with individuals experiencing mental health crises. It may also set a precedent for similar legislation in other states, impacting both policing strategies and criminal accountability. The primary negative outcome of this bill would obviously be the increase in assaults on police, further risking their lives when dealing with violent criminals and the emotionally disturbed. Now shifting into the censorship briefing. The Senate advanced the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act, requiring automakers to include AM radios in all new cars. Tesla, Audi, BMW, and Volvo have removed AM radio, citing interference from electric drivetrains. Critics argue the phase-out limits access to emergency broadcast and independent news. The bill's passage would preserve AM radio as a vital communication tool. The removal of AM radio could further centralize control over public information, pushing users toward digital platforms controlled by major tech companies or the government. Any loss of widespread AM radio usage removes a critical contingency communication method. Okay, we're going to stop here for this week's summary of recent developments. If you want all the coverage that's being delivered on the Gray Man Briefing, sign up at thegraymanbriefing.com. Thanks for listening, and as always, remain aware, be vigilant, and stay safe.
Get unredacted, real-time briefings sent via email and through the Telegram and Signal apps by joining the Gray Man Briefing.